Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. As he said, I'm Dr. Donna Harrison. I'm a board-certified OBGYN, practiced in Michigan for a decade before assuming leadership in the American Association of Pro-Life OB-GYNs. And I have a couple of disclosures. The first one is I have been dragged to this issue kicking and screaming, as have most pro-life OBGYNs. I was not always of the opinion that I am now. It's taken 15 years worth of work to get there. And this is not the official position of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. I'm speaking here as myself. I'm not speaking as the executive director. But I think this issue is important. As a reproductive age woman who went through medical school and residency, I couldn't avoid the issue. As an OB-GYN, I couldn't avoid the issue. What does hormonal contraception do, and how do contraceptives work? And it is remarkably difficult to penetrate the marketing spin that's out there to actually get to the reality of how these things work. But we know very well how these things work. So that's what I'm going to present to you today. There's questions that this lecture cannot answer, and there's questions that this lecture is going to try to answer. I cannot answer whether or not a couple should contracept. I cannot answer what kind of contraception a couple should use. I can't answer the question, does it matter if only a small number of embryos are lost while you are contracepting? I will try to answer this question. Can embryos be formed during the use of contraception? If an embryo is formed during the use of a certain kind of contraceptive method, what environment does that embryo face? And how can we evaluate the risk to the embryo? So with that, we're going to start with you can help me, with a little tiny video. If you could just stay up there until we get through implantation, and then we'll stop. Okay, thanks.
Are you ready here?
This is how God does it. This is the release of sperm swimming up the birth canal in millions of numbers through, don't you love the music? This is the opening of the cervix, the opening of the womb. And some of those sperm make it into the womb. And some of them are trapped in the mucus, and some make it into the opening of the womb. And there's, in the opening of the womb, there's two tubal openings. One of those tubes has an egg. And God made it so most of the sperm actually can sense where that egg is. And that's where you see that little bit of light there. It's so well done. So those lucky sperm that find the right tubal opening swim up. The music gets really loud here, it's great. Through the tube, and as you'll see in the tube, there's all this lush velvety lining. See all those little cilia there? Those cilia move in response to the hormones. They actually help the sperm swim up. And all those cilia are all hormonally responsive to the exact hormonal milieu that a woman is supposed to have in the middle of her cycle. And there is the egg, sitting in the middle of the tube, already released. There's 24 hours after egg release where an egg can be fertilized. Only 24 hours out of the month. And those little sperm try to get through the cloud, the mucin cloud, which is the cumulus auriferans. And they have to struggle to get in. But there's that sperm. We're going to watch him or her. Because it's actually the male that determines whether, the sperm that determines whether the new human being is going to be a boy or a girl. And once one sperm penetrates, no other sperm can penetrate. In that moment, in that instant, the whole cloud changes. The what is now the beginning of a human being starts so that you can't have any other sperm penetrate. The sperm finally penetrates, and they're showing it penetrating the nuclear membrane. The tail flips off. And in this beautiful moment, you have the syngamy, which is the fusing of the nuclei. But from the moment of sperm-egg penetration, you actually have a new human being. This is a two-celled embryo. From the moment of sperm-egg penetration, you have a one-celled embryo. There's no such thing as a fertilized egg. There's a sperm, there's an egg, and there's an embryo. That's all there is. This embryo rolls with all those velvety cilia, rolls down the tube, and that rolling is actually an important part of the embryo's development, and is finally released into the endometrial cavity. Whoa, where it continues to fall and roll. And then an opening in the blastocyst happens, and you have the embryo implanting into the lining of the uterus. That's pretty cool. It's just so cool. Oops, get me back up there. So why do I show you that? Because the events that happen from the time of egg release till the time of fertilization, or till the time of implantation, become critically important to understand if you want to talk about contraception. And I'll explain a little bit more why. So we're going to really briefly and graphically, line drawing, review the important events. So this is anatomy here. This is a womb. Looks a lot like a goat, but it's actually a womb. What you have is, this is the uterus. These are the tubes. You have an ovary on either side. And menses, day 1, is the part of the woman's cycle where the blood comes out. That is day 1 of a woman's cycle. Okay? First shedding of the lining is day 1. Ovulation, the release of an egg, is day 12. Fertilization has to be accomplished within 24 hours of egg release, so we'll put that at day 12. And implantation takes place day 21. So we've got day 12 to 21, that's a long time. So what happens is one of the side of the ovaries, one of the ovaries forms a cyst, and every woman has cysts. They all do. 2 centimeters, that's where the eggs are made. The egg is formed inside that egg sac, that cyst, and then is released, is fertilized right here, and goes on to implant. Okay? The words we use matter, just like, as good Lutherans you know, the words matter. So it's really important that we understand and use the correct terminology, because otherwise you'll be made to look a fool when what you have to say is very important. Fertilization. Fertilization is the process of fusion of the sperm and egg to form the embryo. It is the moment, it's not days, it's not weeks, it's the moment that the sperm membrane fuses with the egg membrane, because at that point you have a unique living human being who is called an embryo. An embryo is defined as the youngest form of a being. Okay? An embryo is formed at the moment of sperm-egg membrane fusion, and from that point on, that individual organism has all the criteria of a human being. They repair themselves, they have self-directed growth, they will have one continuous existence through embryo, fetus, toddler, newborn, teenager, adult, older adult. It's one continuous existence. This one-celled embryo is not a fertilized egg. This one-celled embryo is, what did it do? Okay. This one-celled embryo is given a special name called a zygote. Okay, that's a one-celled embryo, and then it goes on to be a 2-celled, 4-celled, etc. embryo. Scientifically, there is no such thing as a fertilized egg. It's a rhetorical term given to downplay the significance of what happens at fertilization. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about is implantation. Implantation is the process of the embryo attaching to the lining of the uterus. You saw it. It's pretty cool. The embryo's blood vessels grow into and are surrounded by the blood vessels of the mom. They intertwine, they hold hands. That's what I tell students. It's pretty cool. Now, we'll get to some terms that are important. Conception. We all know life begins at conception, right? From the mid-1800s, when the science of embryology began, it was all known that conception is the same thing as fertilization. Everybody assumed that. However, and most people then and now believe that life begins at conception. But what you may not know is that at the time that contraceptives were being developed, in the mid-1960s, the word contraception was invented to describe the prevention of conception, but there was a problem. So at that time, the American College of OB-GYN, 1967 actually, changed the legal meaning of conception to mean, legally, the completion of implantation. So, this change allowed for the use of drugs and devices which act after fertilization to be technically classified as contraceptives because they prevent conception, conception being the completion of implantation. So at Apolog, we actually avoid that term conception altogether. We talk about fertilization, and we talk about drugs and devices which can kill an embryo or are embryocidal. We'll talk about that in a minute. So using the current ACOG definition, a contraceptive is any drug or device which prevents the formation of a recognized pregnancy. And so that's essentially, you will not be able to determine a recognized pregnancy until there's enough pregnancy hormone elaborated after implantation to recognize that you're pregnant. So recognized pregnancy happens 2 weeks after fertilization. Okay. A contraceptive can work in any of the following ways: preventing an egg from being released, preventing sperm from meeting the egg, or preventing the embryo from implanting in the uterus. Those are all recognized modes of action of contraceptives. So what about this word abortion? An abortion is the ending of a pregnancy. But since the legal definition of conception equals implantation, then pregnancy legally begins at the completion of implantation. So the term abortifacient is for drugs and devices which end the life of an embryo after implantation. So with a very straight face, the contraceptive companies can say, my drugs are not abortifacients. And technically, they're correct. Some of them. So technically, if a contraceptive acts after fertilization but before implantation, it cannot be classified as an abortifacient. So we use the term embryocidal. That is, very clear, embryo forms at fertilization, embryo killed. You kill an embryo. All right, so that's background so that we're very precise with our terminology. I'm going to go through briefly the types of contraception before focusing on hormonal contraception. There are 3 different gross categories of contraception: barrier methods, intrauterine methods, and hormonal methods. I'm going to talk really briefly about barrier methods. So you saw sperm comes here, fertilization here, after the egg's released, and then the egg travels down and implants. The point of a barrier method is is to prevent the sperm from reaching the egg. So sperm release happens and egg release happens, but the sperm don't reach the egg, and no perfect barrier exists. So in order to boost the efficacy to prevent the sperm from reaching the egg, most of the time spermicides are used in addition to the barrier, at least for reversible barrier methods. So the barrier methods are divided into those that can be reversed and those that can't. We'll talk about reversible methods. They're all kind of the same thing. There's condoms, there's diaphragm, there's cervical cap, and there's a sponge. They all have a mechanical barrier which prevents gross passage of sperm a lot of sperm from getting in, and then spermicides to take care of the sperm that slip around the barrier. If an embryo is formed during the use of a reversible barrier method of contraception, there's no known change in the woman's reproductive tract. Her hormones are the same, tubes are functioning normally, cilia are waving the egg down, I did it again, the embryo down into the endometrium, and the embryo can implant. So they don't have any harm to the newly created embryo that we know of. Well, there's permanent barrier methods as well. That can be male or female, tubes tied. So in a male, it's called a vasectomy. What happens is you have normal spermatic tubes. Here's testes. This is the prostate. Normal spermatic tubes that are cut, tied, burned. And the connection between where the sperm are produced and where the sperm are stored is cut off, literally. A portion of the vas deferens, which is the tube, is removed, burned, tied, or cut. So there's a blockage preventing sperm passage. If an embryo is formed after a vasectomy, the embryo does not encounter any changes in his or her mother's reproductive tract. So tubes are functioning fine, hormone milieu is okay, endometrium should allow for implantation. So an embryo formed after vasectomy faces the same environment in the womb as if the vasectomy didn't happen. If they make it to an egg, the embryos should be okay. No known harm to embryos. Then there's tubal ligation in females. So you've got this thing that looks like a goat. You've got the womb. Here's the tubes, the ovaries. Afterward, it's the same thing. The tube is cut, burned, or otherwise occluded. Sometimes it can be occluded from the inside, from the outside. What you have is a tubal scarring or blockage which prevents sperm from reaching the egg. Sperm get to here and stop. Egg comes over here and stops, so the sperm don't reach the egg, theoretically. However, no contraceptive method ever is perfect. Okay? They all fail. They all fail at a certain rate. These fail rarely. But when an embryo is formed after a tubal ligation, you've got a problem, because the scarring makes the embryo's passage into the womb more difficult. And so it's much more likely that if some sperm escape here and manage to make it through here and fertilize the egg, that the embryo formed may not be able to get into the womb. So you're much more likely to have an ectopic pregnancy. An ectopic pregnancy is a problem because as it grows, obviously you can't put a term pregnancy in a tube. It doesn't stretch that far. So as the baby grows, it ruptures the tube and the woman dies. 95% of the time when ectopic pregnancies are discovered, there's no embryo that's formed. It got to a certain point and stopped forming. But 5% of the time you will get an embryo forming to the point where you can see the heartbeat. That becomes a very difficult issue. But if we don't remove the ectopic, she dies. So those are barrier methods. Intrauterine methods. I'm just going to say this because it's important for you to understand. There's so much spin out there. So I'm going to read from a government website. It says, a copper IUD prevents sperm from reaching and fertilizing the egg. It may prevent the egg from attaching in the womb. If fertilization of the egg does occur, the physical presence of the device prevents the fertilized egg from implanting into the lining of the uterus. That's mild. Yes, it certainly does kill embryos. It kills embryos in the process of travel down because the copper ions actually kill the embryo after formation. If the embryo travels to the lining of the womb, it prevents the embryo from implanting inside the womb because any foreign body, just like a splinter in your hand, sets up an inflammatory reaction, and the embryos can't implant in the presence of an inflammatory reaction. And if the woman is already pregnant, this will disrupt and cause an abortion. So the IUD is a serious bad actor. This is even true for hormonal IUDs. So I'll read what the government website says. It says a hormonal IUD releases a progestin, we'll talk more about that, into the uterus. The released hormone causes thickening of the cervical mucus, inhibits sperm from reaching the fertilized egg, thins the uterine lining, and may prevent the ovaries from releasing eggs. All right, well, yeah, what is this thins the uterine lining? That's a euphemism, okay? It's a euphemism for preventing implantation. Preventing the ovaries from releasing eggs, the hormonal IUD will, for the first year of its use, decrease the egg release rate from 60% per cycle to 30% per cycle. You still have half the eggs being released. Inhibits sperm from reaching the egg. That's true unless a woman releases an egg. So if any of you know natural family planning, you'll know that there's a dry phase, a very thin mucus phase, and that's the point of time where the egg's going to be released, and then a dry phase after that. So the studies that were done which show that sperm can't reach the egg in the presence of hormonal contraception were done during the phase where she's not releasing an egg. It was very clever. But when you actually look at cervical mucus in IUD users or in women who use hormonal contraception that release an egg, that have a normal hormone milieu, the cervical mucus is just fine, and there is actually no prevention of sperm during that time. So it's very clever. The studies are done very cleverly. But the thing that you need to know is that embryos formed during the use of either a copper or a hormonal IUD will almost always die. And they will die directly because of the presence of the IUD. The presence of the IUD inside the uterus sets up an inflammation, whether it's Mirena or whether it's copper IUD or whether it's plastic IUD, they all work the same way. They set up an inflammation inside the lining, which makes it difficult or impossible for the embryo to implant. If implantation has taken place, the IUD will disrupt the implantation, causing an abortion. How do we know that? Because IUD users have used IUDs in the second half of the cycle, after implantation, as an emergency contraceptive. So if you look up emergency contraception, an IUD in the late luteal phase, which is the second half of the cycle after implantation, IUD is very effective in preventing pregnancy. The only way it can prevent pregnancy at that point is to disrupt an implanted embryo. Furthermore, if the pregnancy proceeds on and the IUD is in place, there's a large amount of literature showing that the woman has an increased miscarriage rate, increased rate of infection, increased rate of preterm birth. I mean, IUDs and pregnancy are horrible. Embryos die is the bottom line. I want to show you something else that was published in, got to get the date correct, 2008, in an international contraceptive workshop called the Ashri Capri Workshop. And this was published bold-facedly. And they said, moreover, if it was conclusively shown that the sole or principal mode of action was to prevent an embryo from implanting, this is in an IUD, then this method, as in the case with emergency contraception, would be considered by the Roman Catholic Church as causing an early abortion. As a result, many agencies involved in the research, development, or delivery of contraception prefer to leave the mechanism of action unresolved, which may explain why research into the contraceptive mechanisms of IUDs has been sparse in the last 20 years. They went on to say this: there is sufficient evidence to suggest that IUDs can prevent and disrupt implantation. This is back in 2008. This is no secret. The extent to which this interference contributes to its contraceptive action is unknown. The data are scanty, and the political consequences of resolving the issue interfere with comprehensive research. I don't know. I don't know how it works. So now we're going to talk about hormonal methods. These are a couple of different hormonal methods, but all hormonal methods actually work kind of pretty much the same way. There's only one exception, which I'll talk about at the end if we have time. They have the presence of an artificial hormone called progestin. That artificial hormone called progestin interferes with the signal from the woman's brain to the woman's ovaries that tell the women's ovaries to develop an egg, to release an egg, and then to make the right hormones afterward. And again, this is from a government website. Hormonal methods of birth control use hormones to regulate or stop ovulation, egg release, and to prevent pregnancy. Hormones can be introduced into the body through various methods: pills, injections, skin patches, gels, rings, intrauterine systems, implantable rods. Depending on the type of hormones that are used, these pills can prevent ovulation, thicken cervical mucus, which helps block sperm, or thin the lining of the uterus. Healthcare providers prescribe, monitor, and administer hormonal contraceptives. Okay. This is again from the same government website. The pill works in several ways to prevent pregnancy. It suppresses ovulation, causes cervical mucus to become thicker, except when she's actually releasing an egg. And the pill also does not allow the lining of the womb to develop enough to receive and nurture a fertilized egg. Okay. So they admit this, but it's not emphasized. So we're going to talk a little bit about the details of how this works. And I'm not trying to scare you with this, with this graph. Bear with me a minute, because it is kind of important that you understand. It will make discussion much easier. The pituitary is the part of the brain, okay? The ovary, down here where the eggs are made and released, this is the hormones that the ovaries release. This is the lining of the womb. This is changes that take place in cervical mucus. And this is the cervical mucus scale. It's called a Spin-Barkite scale. If you guys are familiar with natural family planning, this is one of the things that a woman monitors to figure out whether she's fertile, whether she's close to releasing an egg. So the brain has two hormones that it releases. One is this blue line called follicle-stimulating hormone, and one is this pink line called luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates follicles. That's why it's called FSH. So the follicle-stimulating hormone is released, and as it increases, the follicles grow. But there's a second signal that comes from the brain called luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone is what causes the egg to come out of the follicle. Okay, so luteinizing hormone is very important. For ovulation. And it's at this peak, within 12 hours of the peak, that the egg will be released. In order for the brain to know when to release the egg, it actually tastes the amount of hormone that's in the woman's body. So it's tasting all the time. And it's tasting for the beginning of production of a hormone called progesterone. As progesterone rises just a little bit, sends luteinizing hormone through the roof, and it's that little bit of rise in progesterone right here, sorry, this is progesterone, this is estradiol, a little bit of rise in progesterone made by the ovary, the egg getting bigger, that causes this spurt, okay? But luteinizing hormone doesn't just release an egg. It turns out that the amount, the area under the curve for you scientists, the amount of luteinizing hormone, the total amount that's released, is directly proportional to turning these cells here, these cells that line the Graafian follicle, that line the place where the egg's produced, into cells that make progesterone. The corpus luteum makes progesterone. So in the case of luteinizing hormone, you have three things that could happen. You could have a wimpy little peak in luteinizing hormone, in which case this ain't going to happen. Okay, so we'll kind of go through that. And then you could have a very nice peak, in which case you get a very nice corpus luteum, or you could have kind of a meh peak, which allows for egg release, but not enough to actually make progesterone the second half of the cycle. So how do birth control pills work? And not just birth control pills, but any hormonal contraceptive. This is implants, this is injections, this is vaginal rings. They all work by using an artificial hormone called a progestin. Okay? It's not progesterone. Progestins do some of what progesterone does, but block some of what progesterone does. So this progestin is not supposed to be there in the first half of the cycle. And what this progestin does, the presence of progestin here interferes with this egg release. Okay? So you can get progestins to block the growing follicle by making a wimpy little LH surge. They interfere with the ability of the pituitary to taste progesterone and to make an LH surge. Or you can get progestins giving a wimpy LH surge so that the egg's released, but corpus luteum production doesn't happen very well. How often does that happen? It's taken 15 years, 4 of us, 15 years, to go back to the actual development literature of the hormonal contraceptives to figure out how often that happens. And there's a story behind that too. But about 30% of the time. So this is from a presentation of our research of a paper we presented last year. It's a systematic review of hormonal contraception. And what we did was we went back into the hormonal contraceptive literature because most OB-GYNs do not have time to do 15 years worth of research to figure this stuff out. They just don't. The papers that reach the OB-GYNs all say there's no ovulation with the birth control pill. There's no ovulation. Okay, so you pull up these papers that are in the contraception or OB-GYN Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. They all say 1% ovulation or no ovulation. And we couldn't figure that out, really? Because that 1% kind of matches the pregnancy rate that you expect at the end of people using the birth control pill. So we went back, and just like changing the definition of conception to the whole world of biology and science, ovulation means you release an egg. It's the release of an ovum from the Graafian follicles. That's what ovulation means. However, in contraception research, ovulation means release of an egg plus normal progesterone production in the second half of the cycle. So, by redefining the term ovulation, it's called Hoogland ovulation, by redefining the term ovulation, they can with a straight face say to you, only 0 or 1% of the time does ovulation ever happen, because only 0 or 1 or a few percent of the time is there ever egg release plus normal progesterone production. However, okay. When you look by ultrasound at these women who are on the birth control pill, what you find is anywhere from 10 to 50% of these women are making follicles of the size that eggs come from. Okay, 13 millimeter follicle is the size that an egg comes from. Okay, and oops, let me go back here. Okay, so how often do 13 millimeter follicles occur with birth control pills? 1/3 of the time. 30% of the time. So let me give you some numbers to put this in perspective, okay? A woman who has not got any kind of contraception on board will make eggs 60% of the cycles. Okay, so 60% of the time, a woman will make an egg during that cycle. That kind of an ovulation rate, if you take 100 women, 85 will be pregnant at the end of a year. Okay? So 60% ovulation rate yields 85 pregnancies in 100 women at the end of a year. Okay? So if you have a 32% ovulation rate, that's half a normal, you'd expect 45 pregnancies or 40 pregnancies at the end of the year. It's not what you see on birth control pills. You see 1 or 2. Out of 100 women on the pill, 1 or 2 will get pregnant. So we got a problem. We got a problem that we've got follicles being made that could ovulate 1/3 of the time. How often are eggs released and progesterone, suboptimal progesterone production occur? So the egg's out, and we measure the progesterone, and it's inadequate to support a pregnancy. 30% of the time. This is a problem. So we get eggs released, we got inadequate progesterone production. Now, opponents will say, well, we don't know if those eggs can be fertilized. Granted, we don't have a fertilization marker. We cannot prove that those eggs can be fertilized. But what we can say is that in the IVF literature, in the vitro fertilization literature, for egg donors, they used to put those egg donors on the birth control pill so that these egg donors wouldn't get pregnant. Okay? And then they'd harvest the eggs from the egg donors after stimulating them. And they fertilized as well or better than women, than eggs that were not eggs that were produced by donors who were not on the birth control pill. So in IVF egg donors, their eggs fertilized on the pill. Why would we not expect that these eggs could fertilize on the pill? But I will grant you, there is an argument to be said, you cannot prove to me that those 30% of the time that, when the eggs are released, that those eggs are fertilizable. And that's why if you guys know any gazillionaires that would love to fund some really, really important research, we have identified a couple researchers who are capable of identifying a fertilization marker. We just need the buku bucks to pay them because the researchers don't work for free. But that's the issue with the pill. You got too many ovulations and too few pregnancies. So somewhere between 2 and 60% of cycles have egg release. Why do I say 60%? Some of the studies actually showed that some types of low-dose pills don't prevent egg release at all. It's not known how many of those eggs are fertilized and not known how many embryos are formed. So I cannot stand here and say every time an egg's released on the pill, there's an embryo formed. I can't even say that they're formed at the normal rate. But I can say that there's too much egg release and too few pregnancies to add up. Something else has to be happening. All hormonal contraceptives interfere with progesterone production by a woman's ovary, whether it's the Mirena IUD or whether it's an implant. They all interfere with that signal from the brain to the ovary, and thus the ovary's ability to make progesterone the second half of the cycle. Without enough progesterone, the embryo dies. How do we know that? IVF literature, from in vitro fertilization literature, we know that there is a spectrum of progesterone production on which the transferred embryos survive. The lower the progesterone, the less rate of transferred embryos surviving. The higher the progesterone, the higher rate it survives. And there's a threshold beyond which that's kind of the optimum progesterone. And that's why all women who have IVF, in vitro fertilization, are all put on natural progesterone after the transfer so that their embryo will survive. Progestin-only contraceptives also interfere with the transport of the embryo to the womb. So if you have a progestin-only pill, what we find, that beautiful waving cilia that you saw in the tube, is waves because of progesterone. So if you have a progestin, that cilia doesn't act normal. So that when it comes time, so the egg is not swept into the womb at the correct time for the embryo to implant. So when it comes time for the embryo to implant, it comes out in the tube. And that's why progestin-only contraceptives have an increased rate of ectopic pregnancy. All hormonal contraceptives interfere with the development of the endometrial lining. You saw that on the government website. They have to admit it. Thins the lining. That means there isn't enough progesterone around to enough estrogen in the first half of the cycle and enough progesterone to cause the 200 and some molecular changes that have to happen to make implantation possible. So all hormonal contraceptives interfere with the development of the endometrial lining so that embryos that are formed are less likely to be able to implant. Okay. So let's talk for a minute about emergency contraceptives. There's two. One is Plan B, which is a high-dose progestin. One or two pills of high-dose progestin are taken either once or 2 doses 12 hours apart. They can't possibly delay egg release by the same mechanisms that we saw. You remember that beautiful picture of all the wavy lines? The presence of progesterone several days before egg release will block the development of the follicle. It will. However, we know that the closer you get to egg release, the less likely blockage is to occur, the more likely escape ovulation. And if progestin, high-dose progestin, is taken within 12 hours of egg release, no egg release is prevented. But no pregnancies happen. How does that happen? Same way it happens with everything else. There's an interference with the LH peak so that egg release is allowed, but progesterone production the second half of the cycle is not. If you take high-dose progestin after egg release, it doesn't really do very much. Okay, so you've got egg release, you've got fertilization, and then you take high-dose progestin Plan B, second half of the cycle, it doesn't do much because the cat's already out of the bag. The point of interference is the point of LH release, which is what happens right before ovulation. So you'll see lots and lots of studies saying we gave Plan B to these women and we got the expected number of pregnancies, so we know that Plan B doesn't do anything to interfere with pregnancy. That ain't true, buddy. You gave it at the wrong time in the cycle to see the interference. The interference happens when it's taken shortly before egg release, because that's when it interferes with LH. There is no interference with sperm transport that... This makes me crazy. So you get these authors saying, well, Plan B works by interfering with sperm transport. Okay, now let's think about this, buddy. Sperm that are released are in the fallopian tube within 4 hours. 4 hours of sperm release, okay? So you have unprotected intercourse, or I hate that term. So you have sex and you don't want to be pregnant. And you go to the pharmacy 6 hours later and you take your Plan B 12 hours later, okay, ain't going to happen, buddy. I don't care what it does to sperm 3 days later. It doesn't matter. 4 hours after egg release, or after sperm release. And sperm survive for 5 days in the woman's reproductive tract. If Plan B is taken shortly before ovulation, okay, yeah, we already said that. Okay, so we'll talk about Ella, which is the other drug for emergency contraceptive. Ella is a problem. Ella is a second-generation RU46. It is equally potent, milligram for milligram, with RU46. You can do abortions with Ella, same way you do them with RU46. They're the same drug. Okay, it blocks progesterone in cells just like RU46. It can possibly delay egg release. If you take it 4 to 2 days before an egg is to be released, you could delay egg release just like Plan B can. But the closer to ovulation, the greater the possibility of egg release. And if taken the day before ovulation, and all these studies have been done, all eggs are released, no pregnancies happen. But there's more. Unlike Plan B, Ella is very effective after egg release because, and there's no interference with sperm transport at all. Ella can prevent egg release, but it can also prevent implantation by directly disturbing the effect of progesterone on the endometrium. Ella also breaks down the ability of the ovary to produce progesterone. It's an anti-progesterone. It's an anti-progestin. That's how RU46 works. That's how Ella works. And by the way, RU46 could be used as an emergency contraceptive also. So that's the bad news, guys. And I don't give you this information without some pain to myself. I was one of 4 authors who said that what I just presented to you couldn't happen. I authored that paper back in 1998 because we made a key assumption that the contraceptive researchers were telling the truth when they said that ovulation didn't happen. And when we went back and actually looked at the papers, they were lying. Okay, so this is an act of repentance on my part. So I feel the pain of the reality of this, but if we're going to face reality, we have to face reality and its implications. And this is part of facing the implications of reality. There's 3 key questions to ask your doctor. When you're in the doctor's office and you're trying to figure out, am I going to use some kind of contraceptive? Ask them, does this method ever fail? There's a clue. All methods fail. They all fail. They have a published failure rate, which you can find on the web. That's the rate at which pregnancies are detected in women using this method. In other words, all methods allow sperm to reach an egg and allow pregnancy to happen at some defined rate. This failure rate varies depending on the type of contraceptive method used. Second question, when an embryo is formed inside my body, are my natural body processes somehow changed by the contraceptive drug or device in ways that make it more difficult for my embryonic child to survive? That's an important question. And 3, can this method kill an embryo which is already implanted? Okay, so if I'm pregnant already and I start the contraceptive, can I kill a baby that's already there? Here are the difficult questions to ponder. And there are some difficult ones, and like I said, I feel the pain of this. Does it matter if a few embryos die as a consequence of using a particular contraceptive method? Are human beings really a gift from God? Is the fruit of the womb a reward from God? And this is the one that hurts the most. As a reproductive age female, married, medical school residency, will God really be there if I can't make it without His help? If I allow myself to allow Him to direct my reproductive future, is He going to be there for me? Will He really supply all my needs? And now I wanted some time for questions. How much time do I have? Do I have time? Okay. So I made it a little bit shorter. We can go into painful detail with all of this stuff, but I just wanted to hit the highlights and then leave some time for questions, because this is a really tough topic. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have some books or materials that we could get our hands on?
Yeah, there's a book published by Concordia Publishing House that came out a few years ago. It's called The Ethics of Sex. And I did a chapter which doesn't go into this amount of detail. It's kind of a high fly. But The Ethics of Sex by Concordia Publishing House. There's a bunch of other really good essays in there too.
We also received permission from Concordia Publishing House to adapt that chapter
Good.
As part of a volume that Lutherans for Life has published called Grounded in God's Word. That came out last fall. You can get it from CPH, and it has Dr. Harrison's research as well as a lot of other materials on a lot of other life issues. And then finally, we are video and audio recording this presentation, so we'll make that available as well.
We'll make that available in about 3 to 6 months. And the reason is because this is painful. This is even painful for pro-life OB-GYNs, and we are working through the implications of that before I can make this a publicly available lecture. Thanks.
But there will be a
There will be.
record of
Yes.
all the information that's been shared. But the relevant facts, most of them are in that Ethics of Sex chapter. The new research really just sort of confirmed some of the things that suggested.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Yeah, go ahead.
If all IVF women are given progesterone, how come there's so many failures of the IVF? It's like 60% or 60%?
Yeah, it's about a third. You're right. It's about a third will actually end up with a live birth. I don't know. I'm not an expert on IVF. And it's a great topic. And if you guys wanted to get into that topic, I'd suggest a speaker who is Dr. Jeff Keenan, who had the National Embryo Adoption. He had the National Embryo Adoption Program. So, but I'm not a speaker on that detail. Yes, go ahead, sir.
As a member of the aging baby boomer generation, I'm so thankful for the earlier church leaders who were against contraception, but because I was in that generation, we used that contraception method, and I'm also thankful that God has given us the chance to ask for forgiveness of all of our sins, the known and the unknown. And I did not know that we were killing babies. I thought we were preventing fertilization.
And 99% of OB-GYN doctors, including the pro-life ones, also didn't know this. I mean, honestly, it's taken us 15 years to dig this out. And when we got to it, we were pretty angry because this was a deliberate misinformation of OB-GYNs. And family practice docs. I mean, if you ask them right now, they toe the party line, because you have to understand, OB-GYNs and family practice doc education is heavily funded by the pharmaceutical industry, including the birth control, the hormonal contraceptive pharmaceuticals. They fund a lot of education, and they're not going to fund this research. This research was not funded, by the way. Yeah.
Would you review the time frames involved with Plan B?
Yeah, okay. So give me a second. Can I go back? Because it's easier for me to do it with the slides that I had. So I'm going to go through the, with this. So, This is day one of a woman's cycle, okay? You can see, if you could see it well enough, she's got a little blood coming out here. So this is day one. This is day 12 of an average cycle, day 12 to 14. And this is day 28 when she bleeds again, okay? So just to give the time parameters. So ovulation, the signal to ovulate happens on day 12. The actual ovulation happens on day 14 of the cycle, okay? This peak is day 12 of the cycle. If you take Plan B here, right, shortly after menstruating, it does nothing. If you take Plan B here around day 4 to maybe day 8, you'll get a delay. You'll arrest this follicle for about 5 days. Okay, so you'll get a delay of follicle maturation. If you take Plan B close to day 10, you got maybe a third of the eggs that are going to be released, because you don't get as much of a delay. You don't get as much of an arrest. Some of those follicles are beyond the point of arrest. If you take Plan B day 11, right before, or even early day 12, right before the LH peak, there's no follicle arrest. Okay, there's no prevention of egg release. I said follicle arrest, meaning, okay, so there's no prevention of egg release, but there's no pregnancies. So the studies that have done looking at timing of Plan B have shown, this is where we get it from. This is where I get the information from the studies that actually looked at when do you give Plan B and what happens by ultrasound with these follicles. You get follicle rupture, but at the end there's no pregnancy. So something has happened between this event and when we would have expected a pregnancy with Plan B. If you take Plan B here, day 15, 16, does nothing. Expected number of pregnancies happen. So it doesn't, the only time Plan B is actually effective is taking Plan B between day 4 and 8 of a cycle. And the difficulty is, how do you know exactly when a woman's going to ovulate? So again, if any of you have worked with natural family planning, you know predicting ovulation is a little tricky. And women can ovulate early, they can ovulate late. It's very difficult to proactively predict that time. And that's one reason why, and believe me, the Roman Catholic Church has struggled with this, because they would love to say, oh, in a rape protocol, we can give Plan B and it's okay, but you have to be able to predict ahead of time what the timing of ovulation is going to be, and that's super difficult. Now, there are some ways that you can get closer, and you can do an ultrasound. Probably the best way is to do an ultrasound and measure the follicle. If you've got a follicle that's over 10 millimeters, that's a pre-ovulatory follicle. So that's one way to time it, would be to do an ultrasound and see what the size of the follicles are. But other than that, there's not really a good way. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Does you and your group face legal threats or professional threats for what you're doing here?
We are just opening this discussion with my group, okay? This is a very difficult topic because many of us, myself included, have prescribed birth control pills in the past. Okay, this is a difficult topic. Like I said, I'd rather not do this. We face enough legal threats and professional threats from talking about abortion. I really don't want to open this topic, but the facts are the facts. And I think the reason that I even agree to come and talk about this is because I think women have a right to know. And in our paper, what we said was, this is an informed consent issue. A lot of people don't care. Some women care a lot. And to lie to them is unethical. So, thank you.